what is a synonym of solvency?
Cure, fix, correct. Is that good?
I would like to talk about the solvency detail in evidence package. I cannot understand why these last sentences were underlined.
So, a lot of the affirmative arguments for this topic talk about how genetically modified organisms are the things that cause potential health problems or could cause plants to need greater amounts of herbicides and things. I underlined this sentence. He's talking about the last page of the evidence packet to show that there are other types of mating processes for plants that aren't genetic modification that can cause the same problems. So that last sentence is saying that even if we ban GMOs, we're going to have the same problems because there are other causes. Does that make sense?
So this sentence says when we ban the importing and producing GMO, traditional farming also cause bad effect on natural ecosystem.
Right. Yes, very good. So, in the previous session, we talked about tactics to rebutting an argument, giving alternate causes to the opponent's explanations. That's exactly what we're doing with that piece of evidence.
Thank you very much.
Good question.
Okay, who else has a question?
Thank you.
Well, you should all have a question. Yes.
But when we state our opinion, and we use some evidence to reinforce our opinion, and I think those evidence has various levels.
Mm-hmm.
Like actually, I major in the medicine,
Mm-hmm.
and I read papers about medical researches.
Mm-hmm.
There are many controversial problems like vaccination really works, something like that.
Right.
And there are many opinions. And when we decide which opinion is correct, we focus on the evidence. And some opinion based on the only one expert's opinion.
Right.
The other opinion based on the well-designed research.
Mm-hmm.
And we, in that case, we decide the latter is
Yeah.
maybe correct.
Sure.
And in policy debate, those matters, how those matters concerns?
Well, they matter very much, actually. It's just one of the things that we chose not to spend much time on because there were so many other things that we needed to talk about. But there's what we call a hierarchy of evidence. So there's some evidence that's more useful or more valuable than others. So your personal experience is a form of evidence, but that's not as important as maybe an expert testimony. Or, I could say, vaccines worked for me, so I think they're good. But a medical doctor who says, well, they might be good for some people, but for most people, they're not. Well, clearly, his or her statement would make more, would have more value, right, than my personal experience. Epidemiological studies, that kind of research may be even more important than an expert testimony, although experts often refer to those studies when they're writing in these articles and so forth. So yes, you're absolutely right. The type of evidence is very important. And there are what we call tests of evidence that we can use in argumentation or when we are engaged in argument. I'm not going to go through all of them because there are tests of evidence for each type of evidence. So there are certain questions that we can ask or objections we can raise if it's expert or if it's personal experience or some sort of statistical study. But I'm not going to get into all of that. But what I will say is that there are 3 really important questions you can ask generically, so for any type of evidence. And that is the recency, so how recent is the evidence? And now obviously that's going to be more important on some issues than others. You know, if we wanted to talk about, if we talked about whether or not plants need oxygen for photosynthesis, well, recency of a study for that is probably not that important because we've known that for decades, if not longer. But if something, if someone's making the claim that Prime Minister Abe and his popularity is not very good, well, clearly recency would make a big difference in that particular argument, right? Because if yesterday's popularity was high, but today it's very low, then that makes a difference in that argument. The second test that you can ask is if it's internally consistent. So if the evidence itself is internally consistent. So in this case, if I had that solvency argument, or any argument really, but is it back here in the back?
Mm-hmm.
So now this is a very lengthy piece of evidence, which is why Jake highlighted it so that you don't have to read the whole thing. But it's very important that if you're debating someone and they read a piece of evidence like this, try to quickly, as quick as you possibly can, kind of see what's not underlined or highlighted, and see if the author is consistent in their argument throughout that piece of evidence. Because sometimes they might start off by saying, well, different people say blah, 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 and then later on he might or she might say, well, I believe, okay, and just because someone is reading the first part, well, they probably should read the last part because we would know then that that particular author is not being consistent. So that's the second question that we could ask. The third is the evidence externally consistent? Okay? Now, obviously in debate, we can research and find information on anything. So there's always going to be some question as to whether or not evidence is externally consistent or not. However, we can also look at consensus. So in other words, do most people agree? Do most scientists, for example, agree that global warming is happening? Yes, they do, right? Almost 2,000 of them, the world's leading meteorologists and climatologists, say that the Earth is warming. Now, can I find evidence that says that the Earth is not warming? Yes, I can. But there's only about 12 of those scientists. And they're all paid by the fossil fuel companies. So just because I can find evidence doesn't necessarily make it good evidence, and that question of external consistency can help try to determine a piece of evidence's value in that respect. Does that help?
Thank you.
Can I add to that? You know how in the rebuttal speeches here, you're supposed to be telling your story and convincing them why you're best? This is where you can really say, my evidence is from someone who works there. They have a PhD in science for GMOs. But my opponent's evidence is just coming from the newspaper. So you obviously want to prefer what I'm telling you. And it's that mitigating that Dr. Z was talking about earlier, about making them seem less and you seeming more. So you would definitely want to compare that if you can, about why you have the better evidence.
Is it okay if a speech becomes shorter than 6 minutes?
Yes. It's okay, but not always okay. It sort of depends. If you're dropping a bunch of arguments and your speech is only 4 minutes instead of 6, then that's not good. But if you have answered all of the arguments and you've presented your case and you have nothing else to say, then you may sit down. There's no reason why you have to fill up the entire time that's given for that particular speech, because really all you're doing at that point is just repeating yourself. So, yeah, if you've covered all of your arguments, then yes, absolutely. I mean, would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think that, it's important to try and make the speech last and give detailed explanations, but at the end, if you have a minute left of your speech and you have answered everything and you have nothing else to say, you will seem a lot more confident if you just sit down, as opposed to if you just stand there and continue to try and fill that time by not saying a lot of things. That would make the judge think that you're a bit flustered or disorganized. Like we talked about yesterday, debate is, even though we focus so much on evidence and on arguments, debate is always a presentational and persuasive activity. So the more put together and confident you seem to the judge, the more likely he or she is to vote for you.
What are the 4 stock issues? It's very, very important that you understand these 4 main stock issues of inherency, harms, solvency, and advantage, or what we otherwise would call a cost argument. So, because the whole debate really pivots like a teeter-totter, it pivots on this concept, okay? Because the affirmative must prove these 4 things, and the negative, if the negative wins one of those 4, the negative should win the debate. So everything revolves around this concept. So if you don't understand what these 4 things are, or how they're important in the debate round, you really should ask us. So if I were to ask you, what is inherency?
Inherency shows today's situation about the problem.
Okay, yeah, the situation about the, yes, it does. It's who or what is causing the problem or letting the problem continue. So yes, absolutely.
So, in the affirmative that Shanna wrote, all of the advantages that she talks about, all of the harms, all are caused by the existence of GMOs in Japan, right? So her inherency evidence explains Japan allows the importation and sale of GMOs.
And remember, if GMOs weren't sold in Japan, there would be no reason for us to talk about it. So that's why we have to have inherency to show that there's a reason we should talk about it.